LaPorte, Indiana. The turn of the 20th century. Rolling farmland, dirt roads, and at the end of McClung Road, a tidy pig farm run by a woman the whole town thought they understood. Her name was Belle Gunness, a Norwegian immigrant, a widow more than once over, a large, strong, capable woman who ran her farm alone, raised her children, went to church, and carried herself with the quiet respectability of someone simply making her way in a hard world. To her neighbors, she was a figure of sympathy, a woman who had buried husbands, who had known loss, who kept going anyway. The kind of person you'd want to help, not fear. But Belle Gunness had a private enterprise that no one in LaPorte knew about. In newspapers across the Midwest, in the Lonely Hearts columns, the matrimonial ads, a certain notice kept appearing. A comely widow, it read, owner of a fine farm, wished to meet a gentleman of means with a view toward marriage. Financially secure applicants only. And across the region, lonely bachelor farmers with savings in the bank read those words and felt hope. They wrote back, they packed their things, they withdrew their money, and they boarded trains bound for LaPorte, Indiana, to meet the charming widow who had written to them. Many of them were never seen again. One of the last received a letter that ended with a single chilling line, "Come prepared to stay forever." He emptied his bank account and he went. This case is about one of the most disturbing offenders in American history, and one of the rarest. Because when we picture a dangerous predator, we almost never picture her. A middle-aged widow, a mother, a farmer. And that expectation, that blind spot, was the most powerful weapon she had. It's also a case that has never been fully solved, because when it all finally came apart, in a fire on an April morning in 1908, the central question wasn't just what Belle Gunness had done, it was whether she was even dead at all. So here's the question to carry through everything that follows. How does a person weaponize the very last image anyone would suspect? And when the truth finally catches fire, how do you catch someone the whole world refused to see clearly? Let's find out. Section 2. Background. To understand Belle Gunness, we have to go back, across an ocean, and into a life that began very far from that Indiana farm. And a quick, honest caveat before we start. This is a case from over a century ago, and some of what's told about her early years is tangled up in legend, rumor, and the sensational newspaper writing of the era. So we'll stick to what's reasonably well established and flag the rest as what it is. She was born Brunhild Polsdatter Sturseth in Norway in 1859. By most accounts, she grew up poor, in genuine hardship. As a young woman, she made the crossing that so many did in those years, emigrating to the United States in search of something better, joining family, and eventually settling in the Midwest. She took the name Belle. On its own, that's an ordinary immigrant story. Thousands lived a version of it, and nothing about it points toward what came later. But once Belle began building a life in America, a pattern started to form, and it's a pattern worth watching closely. She married her first husband, and together they ran a business and a household. Then, in 1900, he died, and here's the detail that would echo for the rest of her story. He held life insurance. In fact, on the very day he died, two separate policies briefly overlapped, both active at once. Belle collected on both. A tragic coincidence, it seemed at the time. A grieving widow dealt a cruel hand, left with a modest sum to start over. With that money, she moved to LaPorte, Indiana, and bought her farm. And before long, she married again, a man named Peter Gunness, whose name she would carry for the rest of her life. That marriage brought more sorrow, and quickly. Peter's infant daughter died within a week of the wedding, and Peter himself died only months later from a severe head injury. Belle's explanation was almost strange enough to disarm suspicion by itself. She said a heavy meat grinder had fallen from a high shelf and struck him. The local coroner was skeptical, deeply so, and the matter was actually examined. But in the end, no charges held. Belle collected insurance again, and she carried on. Now step back and look at the shape of it. 2 husbands, gone, insurance money each time, an unusual explanation delivered with composure. Any one of these things, taken alone, is just misfortune, the sort of hard luck that fell on plenty of people in those days. But together, they form the earliest outline of something the town could not yet see. A person who had discovered that tragedy could be profitable, and that a grieving widow is rarely the first person anyone suspects. And that discovery, that her role in the world made her almost invisible to suspicion, was about to become the foundation of everything that followed. Section 3. Psychology Break 1. Let's pause the story and talk about the psychology, because Belle Gunness offers a window into something we very rarely discuss and almost never expect. Start with the assumption that protected her. When we imagine a dangerous, calculating offender, our minds reach for a particular picture, and it is almost never a middle-aged mother running a farm. That gap between who we expect to be dangerous and who actually can be is one of the most exploitable blind spots in human judgment. Belle didn't have to work very hard to seem harmless. The assumptions of her era did that work for her. A widow, a churchgoer, a woman surrounded by children, society handed her a cloak of trust she never had to earn. Think about how this plays out in your own life, even now. We extend instant, unearned trust based on appearances all the time. A friendly face, a respectable role, someone who fits our mental image of safe. It's a useful shortcut most of the time, but it means the people best positioned to deceive us are often the ones who look least like our idea of a threat. Deception doesn't need to defeat our suspicion when it can simply slip beneath it. The second piece is what investigators would call an organized, methodical pattern. What Belle did was not impulsive or chaotic. It was, in a cold and businesslike way, a system. The advertisements were written to attract a specific kind of person, men with money, but also men who were isolated, unattached, unlikely to be quickly missed. She built a repeatable process and ran it again and again like a grim enterprise. That capacity to plan, to be patient, to treat other human beings as line items in a scheme, it's one of the defining features of the most calculating offenders, and it's part of why they can operate for so long. The third piece is the hardest to sit with. A near-total absence of empathy wrapped inside a completely functional life. Belle raised children, she kept a farm running, she managed money, correspondence, a public reputation. Outwardly, she was competent and ordinary in every way. And yet, alongside all of that, she appears to have been able to treat people as means to an end, without the emotional friction that would stop nearly anyone else. That coldness, coexisting with an entirely normal daily life, is what makes offenders like her so genuinely difficult to detect. Key takeaway. Danger doesn't have a fixed face, and the assumption that it does is exactly what the most calculating people rely on. The lesson isn't to grow suspicious of everyone who seems kind or ordinary. It's to understand that character shows itself through patterns of behavior over time, not through whether someone matches our mental picture of a threat. The most effective camouflage Belle Gunness ever wore was other people's certainty that a woman like her simply couldn't be dangerous. Section 4. The first signs. The warning signs around Belle Gunness weren't hidden exactly. They were scattered, spaced out over years, and each one came with a ready explanation that a trusting community was all too willing to accept. Look first at the deaths that trailed behind her. 2 husbands, an infant child, and, as the years on the farm went on, a steady, quiet series of other losses and disappearances. Individually, in an era when death from illness and accident was far more common, none of it necessarily screamed foul play. But the sheer accumulation, the way misfortune seemed to gather around this one woman, was, in hindsight, a signal flashing in plain view. Then there was the strangest early clue of all, and it came from inside her own home. Belle had a foster daughter named Jenny, and according to accounts from the time, Jenny once said something to a classmate that should have stopped everyone cold. She reportedly said that her mother had caused her father's death. A child saying that out loud. It was noticed, it was even discussed, but it was ultimately waved away, the kind of thing that gets dismissed as a child's confusion or exaggeration. And Jenny herself would later disappear from the farm, with Belle explaining that the girl had gone away to school in California. Now consider the men. Suitor after suitor arrived in LaPorte, drawn by those newspaper ads. Neighbors sometimes saw them, a new gentleman at the Gunness farm, helping with chores, staying a while. And then, without fanfare, they'd be gone. Belle always had an answer. He hadn't suited her, he'd moved on, he'd gone back home, or headed west. Each departure, taken by itself, was perfectly plausible. People come and go. But the pattern, men arriving with money and vanishing without a trace, over and over, was building into something no single explanation could cover. Here's what makes this case such a sharp lesson about warning signs. The problem was never a shortage of red flags. The flags were everywhere. The problem was that they were spread thin across years, across different people, each one softened by a reasonable-sounding story and by the town's basic unwillingness to imagine that this particular woman could be behind any of it. No one was tracking the whole. Everyone saw a piece. And that's a pattern that reaches far beyond one farm in Indiana. Dangerous behavior often hides not because it's invisible, but because it's fragmented, divided among people who never compare notes, each holding a fragment too small to alarm them on its own. The tragedy of LaPorte is that almost everyone had a piece of the truth. No one, until far too late, put them side by side. Section 5. The case pattern. To understand the full scope of what happened on that farm, we have to look at the method as a whole, not for the grim details, which we'll leave aside out of respect for the people who lost their lives, but for the cold machinery of how it worked and why it went undetected for so long. The engine of it all was those advertisements. Belle placed matrimonial notices in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, publications read by exactly the kind of men she was looking for. Immigrant bachelor farmers, hard-working, often lonely, frequently isolated from close family, men with savings, but without anyone nearby to raise the alarm if they suddenly went quiet. She wasn't casting a wide net at random, she was selecting for vulnerability. The correspondence that followed was, by accounts, warm and persuasive. Belle drew these men in through letters, building affection, painting a picture of the comfortable life waiting for them on her farm, and, crucially, instructing them to do 2 things: bring their money and keep the trip quiet. Think about how carefully calculated that combination is. Bring everything you have and tell no one where you're going. By the time these men stepped off the train in LaPorte, they had often liquidated their savings and left almost no trail behind them. One of them was a South Dakota farmer named Andrew Helgelian. Late in 1907 and into early 1908, he and Belle exchanged letters, and one of hers reportedly closed with that line we heard at the very start: come prepared to stay forever. Andrew withdrew his money, travelled to Laporte, and was never seen alive by his family again. But Andrew, as it turned out, had something many of the other victims didn't. He had a brother who paid attention. Step back and consider the scale of what was later uncovered on that property. The remains found on the Gunness farm pointed not to one or two tragedies, but to a long series of them, victim after victim, over a span of years. Estimates of the total have ranged widely ever since, from over a dozen confirmed to speculation of many more. Whatever the exact number, it placed Belle Gunness among the most prolific offenders of any kind in American history, and the victims deserve to be remembered as more than a count. They were overwhelmingly hopeful people, men who answered an ad because they were lonely and wanted a partner, a family, a fresh start. Men who arrived carrying not just their savings, but their optimism. The cruelty of the scheme was that it preyed on exactly that hope, on the simple human wish to be wanted. Now, how did this continue for so long, right under a town's nose? Part of the answer we've already seen: the assumptions that shielded her, the isolation of the victims, the plausible cover stories. But part of it was also the deliberate design of the thing. Belle chose victims unlikely to be missed quickly. She kept the men's visits low profile. She controlled the flow of information, what neighbors saw, what she explained, what she left unsaid. Each piece worked together to keep the whole invisible. The larger lesson in this stretch of the story is a stark one. The most enduring harmful schemes are often those built around other people's isolation. Belle's victims were chosen precisely because they stood alone, because no one was close enough or watching closely enough to notice when they disappeared. Connection, it turns out, is a kind of protection, and the people most at risk are so often the ones who have the least of it. Section 6. Psychology Break 2. So we come to the question that this case leaves sitting heavily in the room. What kind of person does this, methodically, for profit, for years, while raising children and running a farm and singing in church on Sunday? We have to be careful here, and doubly so with a case this old. Belle Gunness never explained herself. There's no confession from her, no diary of motives, no interview. So we aren't diagnosing her, and we can't climb inside her head. But we can look at what the behavior itself reveals. The first and most obvious thread is money. On its face, this reads as one of the most coldly financial patterns in all of crime: insurance payouts, the savings of suitor after suitor, harm converted directly into profit. But pure greed doesn't quite capture it. Plenty of people are greedy. Almost none turn to what Belle turned to. Greed was the engine, but something else had to be missing for that engine to run unchecked. And that missing thing is the second thread: a profound emotional detachment, the ability to see other people not as fellow human beings, but as resources. Here's something worth genuinely sitting with. Most of us feel a powerful internal break when we even imagine harming someone who trusts us. It's almost physical, that resistance, that recoil. For a certain kind of offender, that break seems simply not to be there. Belle could apparently correspond warmly with a lonely man, welcome him to her home, and treat his arrival as a transaction, with no visible flicker of the empathy that stops the rest of us. That absence is one of the most chilling things in human psychology, precisely because it's so hard for ordinary people to even imagine. The third thread is control, and this is where her chosen role becomes so revealing. Belle didn't hide in the shadows. She operated in the open as a respectable widow, and she used that position to command every situation. She controlled the letters, the money, the story the town was told, the coming and going on her own land. The respectable widow role wasn't just a disguise she hid behind. It was an instrument of power, a way to stay completely in charge while remaining beyond suspicion. Key takeaway: the people who show the world a warm, trustworthy face, and the people capable of cold, calculated harm, are not always two different groups. Sometimes they're the same person, and the trustworthy face is the very thing that makes the harm possible. A reassuring role tells you how someone is positioned in the world. It does not tell you what they're capable of. That only their actions over time can reveal. Section 7. The investigation. For years, Belle Gunness stayed a step ahead of everyone, not by outrunning an investigation, but because no real investigation had ever begun. What finally changed that came down to two things: one persistent brother and one jealous, discarded man. Let's take the brother first. When Andrew Helgelien traveled to LaPorte and went silent, his family in South Dakota grew worried, and his brother, Asle Helgelien, refused to let it go. Asle began writing letters asking after Andrew, and he wrote to the one person who had drawn his brother to Indiana in the first place: Belle. Belle wrote back with the familiar reassurances. Andrew had come and then moved on. Nothing to see here. But Asle wasn't satisfied by a tidy answer, and he made it known that he intended to come to LaPorte himself and search for his brother. That threat, the prospect of someone actually coming to dig into the truth, appears to have set off alarm on the Gunness farm. Now the second figure. Belle had a hired hand named Ray Lamphere, a man who had fallen for her and grown bitterly jealous of the parade of suitors passing through. Their relationship soured. Belle fired him, and then she did something telling. She went to local authorities and painted Lamphere as a dangerous man who was threatening her, even, reportedly, visiting a lawyer to put her affairs in order and claiming she feared for her life. She was, it seems, building a story, laying groundwork, positioning a convenient culprit in advance. And then, in the early hours of April 28, 1908, the Gunness farmhouse burned to the ground. A hired man escaped the flames and ran for help, but the house was lost. In the ruins, searchers found the remains of 3 of Belle's children and the body of an adult woman. The immediate assumption was the obvious one: a terrible fire, and Belle Gunness among the victims. Ray Lamphere, the man she had so carefully cast as a threat, was arrested. But almost at once, the neat story began to unravel, and here's where the investigation turns genuinely strange. The adult woman's body could not be positively identified as Belle. There were real, unavoidable questions about whether it was even her at all. The remains simply didn't match up cleanly with the large, strong woman the town knew. Investigators and the public alike were left with a deeply unsettling possibility: that the body was not Belle's, and that Belle herself was gone. And then Asle Helgelien arrived, still searching for his brother. With the farm now under scrutiny, searchers began to dig. What they found turned a suspected house fire into one of the most shocking discoveries in American criminal history. Andrew's remains were recovered from the grounds, and then more. The property gave up victim after victim, buried across the farm. The quiet widow's land was in fact the site of a long series of crimes that no one had connected while she lived there in plain sight. The lesson threaded through this investigation is worth holding on to. It wasn't official suspicion that cracked this case open. For years the system saw nothing. What finally forced the truth into the light was the persistence of one ordinary person, a brother who would not accept a convenient answer about someone he loved. Again and again in cases like this, it's that refusal to look away, not from the authorities, but from the people who simply care enough to keep asking, that makes all the difference. Section 8. The capture or breakthrough. Here is where the Belle Gunness case becomes unlike almost any other we've examined because there was no capture. There was a breakthrough in understanding what had happened on that farm, but the central figure herself slipped through the middle of it and may never have been caught at all. Let's be clear about what investigators did establish. The digging on the property left no doubt that the Gunness farm had been the site of a long and deliberate series of crimes. The scheme was real, the victims were real, the matrimonial ads, the vanished suitors, the money that came in, and the men who never left. All of it was, tragically, confirmed by what the ground gave up. On that much, there was finally certainty. But the question of Belle herself splits into a mystery that has never been resolved. Did she die in that fire? Or did she engineer the whole scene, set the blaze, leave behind a body meant to be mistaken for her own, and disappear into the vast country beyond La Porte, free and unaccounted for? The man at the center of the aftermath was Ray Lamphere. And Lamphere, before his own death not long after, reportedly offered a confession that only deepened the intrigue. According to accounts of what he said, Belle had planned her own vanishing. The body in the ruins, he claimed, was not hers at all, but another victim, deliberately left behind to be mistaken for Belle so that the world would stop looking for her. And then, he said, she was gone. Now Lamphere was a discredited, convicted man with reasons of his own, and his account could never be fully verified, but it lined up unsettlingly well with the physical facts, especially the body that didn't match. For decades afterward, the ghost of Belle Gunness haunted the country. Reported sightings surfaced again and again from all over the United States, a woman glimpsed here, a suspicious widow there, each one raising the same question: was that her? None was ever confirmed. Years later, a woman arrested in another state for a strikingly similar crime, poisoning a man for his money, bore a haunting resemblance to Belle and reignited the whole debate. But nothing was ever proven. What exposed the truth of the farm in the end wasn't a dramatic arrest. It was the ground itself and the persistence that forced people to examine it. But the woman who built it all may have done the one thing her victims never got the chance to do. She may have simply walked away and vanished into history, unpunished and unfound. Section 9. The Trial and Outcome. Because Belle Gunness herself was never captured, the courtroom reckoning that followed didn't center on her at all. It centered on the one person left standing in the wreckage, Ray Lamphere, her former hired hand. And the trial that resulted is a revealing lesson in what the justice system can and cannot do. Lamphere was put on trial in late 1908. He faced serious accusations tied to the fire and to the deaths on the farm. But the case against him ran straight into a wall, the same wall that has defined this entire story. Without a positive identification of the woman's body, prosecutors could not firmly establish the most basic facts. If no one could prove the woman in the ruins was Belle Gunness, then the questions of what exactly had happened and who was responsible for what became genuinely difficult to answer in a court of law. The outcome reflected that uncertainty. The jury convicted Lamphere of the arson, of involvement in the burning of the house. But on the graver accusation connected to the deaths, they did not convict. It was a split result and a telling one. The system was willing to hold him responsible for what could be proven and unwilling to go further into territory clouded by too much doubt. And that outcome tells you something important about how justice actually works, especially in a case this murky. A court runs on proof, on what can be established with confidence, not on what everyone strongly suspects. The deep uncertainty at the heart of this case, the unidentified body, the missing woman, the unverifiable claims, didn't just haunt the public imagination, it constrained what the law itself could conclude. There is one more chapter, And it comes not from a courtroom, but from a laboratory, many decades later. In recent years, forensic scientists actually revisited this century-old mystery, exhuming remains in an effort to finally answer the question that 1908 could not. Was the body really Belle's? Using modern techniques that the original investigators could never have dreamed of, they tried to settle it once and for all. And even then, even with the tools of the 21st century, the results came back inconclusive. The mystery held. The justice system lesson here is a humbling one. We would like every case to end in a clean resolution, a verdict, an answer, a closing of the book. But some cases resist that because the evidence simply won't yield it. And there's an integrity in a system and in an inquiry that's willing to say what it cannot prove, rather than force a certainty that was never really there. Section 10. Final Psychology Analysis. So what do we take from the strange, dark, and still unfinished story of Belle Gunness? Let's go back to where we began, the respectable widow on the quiet farm, the last person anyone would suspect, because that image holds the deepest lesson of all. The first lesson is about the danger of our assumptions. Belle Gunness got away with what she did for as long as she did, largely because she didn't fit the picture. She was a woman, a mother, a churchgoer, a figure of sympathy in a hard world, and a whole community's certainty that someone like her simply couldn't be dangerous became the very thing that let her operate in plain view. The takeaway isn't to look at everyone with suspicion, it's to notice that our instinct about who is and isn't a threat is often built on appearances and stereotypes, and that the people best able to cause harm are frequently the ones who least match our expectations. Real danger doesn't come with a warning label. The second lesson is about isolation on both sides of this tragedy. Belle's victims were chosen precisely because they were alone, men without close ties, unlikely to be quickly missed. And what finally began to crack the case was the opposite of isolation, a brother who cared enough to keep asking, who refused to accept that someone he loved could simply vanish without explanation. There's something worth carrying in that. Connection protects people. Paying attention to the vanished, the overlooked, the quietly not heard from. That ordinary act of caring is one of the most powerful safeguards we have. And the third lesson is a harder, humbler one, about the limits of what we can know. This case has never been fully solved. Belle may have died in that fire, or she may have walked away and lived out her years unpunished and unfound. Even modern science couldn't close the door. And rather than pretend otherwise, there's a kind of honesty in accepting that some questions stay open. It's a reminder that the pursuit of truth matters, even when truth doesn't fully arrive, and that the effort to understand is worthwhile in itself. So let's make those takeaways simple and clear. 1. Danger has no fixed face. The most calculating people often rely on not looking the part, and our assumptions become their cover. 2. Isolation is a vulnerability, and attention is a protection. Caring enough to notice when someone goes quiet can matter more than we ever realize. 3. Not every mystery gets solved, and honest inquiry means being willing to sit with the questions that remain. More than a century later, Belle Gunness endures as one of the most unsettling figures in American crime, not only for what she did, but for how completely she exploited the world's refusal to see her clearly, and for the mystery of an ending that may have been her final act of escape. Understanding her story doesn't make us cynical about the kindness in others. It makes us a little wiser about the gap between appearance and truth, and a little more attentive to the people around us who might otherwise slip through unnoticed. If this case helped you understand criminal psychology, warning signs, offender behavior, or how investigations work, consider subscribing to Criminal Psychology Files for more educational case studies. Because the more we understand about how deception hides in plain sight and how it's finally brought to light, the better prepared all of us are to see clearly when it matters most.